Outlook. It's Ilaria Vigo speaking from the Barcelona Supercomputing Center. Before we start, I have to inform you that this session will be recorded. So, having said that, what brings us here today, I guess, is probably the curiosity to gain a deeper understanding about the evolution of CO2 emission and especially their drivers. Today we'll do so by observing what happened during the last decade, focusing on major emitting countries. Also, we'll ask our speaker, what have we seen during the global crisis, such as the pandemic or the energy crisis. Finally, what shall we expect for this 2023 to come? But before jumping into the talks and the discussion, I'd like to give you a bit of context for this outlook. So 4C stands for Climate Carbon Interaction in the Current Century, and it's an European funded project with 12 partners working together towards improving our understandings of the processes controlling the carbon cycle, developing near-term predictions of the climate and carbon cycle, as well as reduce the uncertainties in climate projections to ultimately deliver policy-relevant emission pathways. The Carbon Outlook, it's a yearly product which builds on the global carbon budget of the Global Carbon Project, in which some of the 4C researchers are highly involved, and it also blends the knowledge generated within the 4C project. You should have received the latest Outlook in your inbox before the start of this webinar. On our website, you can find also the previous one and more material. But now I don't want to take too much time, and instead let's jump to the Outlook content. So from Barcelona, I'll give the floor to Miriam and our speakers sitting at the CICERO's offices in Oslo. So enjoy.
Thank you, Ilaria, for these words and for setting it all in context. My name is Miriam Dahl. I'm a senior communications advisor at CICERO Center for International Climate Research in Norway. So I'm sitting here in Oslo together with all our 4 excellent speakers. And before we start hearing from them, I just want to say a few words about who they are. So first, you will hear from Glen Peters. He's a senior researcher at CICERO, working on energy emissions and data, both historically and future scenarios. He's also IPCC lead author in the 6th assessment report, and is part of the executive board of the Global Carbon Project that you just heard about before. The next speaker after that is Ivar Korsbakken. He's also a senior researcher in the climate mitigation group at CICERO. Korsbakken provides China's emissions data and analysis to the annual carbon budget. Then we have another senior researcher from CICERO, that is Robbie. He's also in the climate mitigation group and is a key contributor also to the annual carbon budget, focusing otherwise his research on reducing uncertainty in global and national emissions estimates and explaining their trends. Finally, we have Yen Chin. She's a lead carbon analyst at Refinitiv, based in Oslo. She's a carbon market expert focusing on Europe and China. She also specializes in quantitative research and works with emissions forecasting models. So before we start, I just want to say that if you have any questions during the talk, please put them in the Q&A function that you have. And if you also address them to the person you want to answer, then we will have some time to discuss with all the speakers after the talks. So without further ado, over to you, Glen.
Thank you for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. Great to join you. So what I'm going to talk about is a bit more of the big picture, the trends in global fossil CO2 emissions over the last decades, and my colleagues after me will focus a little bit more on the 2020, 2021, 2022 picture. So zooming out a little bit and looking at global emissions, this figure goes back to 1960, so over the last 60 years or so, and as you're probably aware, global fossil CO2 emissions have been increasing over that entire period. The only time emissions tend to not increase is during some sort of global crisis. So in this figure, you see the two oil crises in the 70s and 80s. We had the collapse of the former Soviets in the early 1990s. Emissions grew very strongly during the 2000s. I'll come back to that a little bit later. At the end of the 2000s, we had the global financial crisis. After that, a lot of stimulus went into the global economy and there was a huge rebound in emissions in 2010. The last decade, the 2010s, you see emissions have grown a little bit slower at the global level. There's a few factors behind that. There has been a little bit of a shift from coal to gas, particularly in the EU and the US. That's helped slow emissions growth. And globally, there's been quite strong growth in renewables, solar and wind, and we can sort of see this effect in the emissions. In 2020, of course, we had the big drop from COVID, a huge rebound in 2021 with emissions coming back up to more or less the same levels and around about 1% growth in 2022. You'll hear much more about that in the following presentations. I'm going to talk a little bit about the last decades, what's caused the changes, and I'm going to do this in two different ways. I'm going to first focus on the fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas, and then I'm going to focus on the top emitters in aggregate terms after that. So first of all, the trends by fossil fuel categories, coal, oil, gas with cement down the bottom there, and I'll go through each of these in turn. First of all, coal in the brown. Coal was one of the sort of first energy sources that really had an impact on the global energy system. Emissions from coal were growing relatively strongly into the 1990s. In the 1990s, we had the big shift and changes in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet, which led to a reduction in inefficient use of coal. During the 2000s, we had a huge growth spurt. Coal passed oil to be the biggest emitting fossil fuel, and this is primarily due to the growth of coal in China. I'll come back to that in a minute. The last 10 years has been really interesting. The growth in coal has leveled out. This surprised many people. 2014 was looking like a peak in coal emissions at the global level. There were a couple of factors which combined to lead to that. There was a slowdown in coal use and even a decline in China in the early 2010s. And this happened at the same time as bigger reductions in the US from the coal to gas shift, coal to renewables shift. That led to a sort of a peak in coal. Coal's been a little bit up and down in the last few years. And now, particularly after the rebound from COVID, it looks like emissions from coal may actually exceed that 2014 level, leading to a new peak. Now jumping to oil, the black line in this figure. Oil was used for a variety of different sources in the energy system, leading up to the oil crises in the 70s and 80s. In this sort of period with the oil crises, we saw a shift in many countries into nuclear, which led to a reduction in oil in the electricity sector. And since then, most of the growth in oil is coming from transportation. And you see that's a pretty steady growth over the last decades. The only real change is the big drop during COVID, which primarily affected our mobility. Coming to gas in the blue on this figure, that's started off pretty small in the energy system at the start of this figure, but has continually grown. Because of the slowdown in coal in the last decade, it actually ends up being gas, which is one of the key drivers of our growth in fossil emissions in the last decade. And just quickly on cement down the bottom there, this is only around about 5% of global fossil emissions. China produces around about 50% or more of cement globally, and so whatever happens in China has a big effect on the cement. But you can see, it's grown at a fairly steady rate in the last decades. Now moving on to the trends by countries. I already mentioned a few countries as I was talking. This is the top 4 emitters in aggregated terms, and the rest of the world in the black at the top. I'll focus first on China in the orange. Quite steady, sustained growth in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then we hit 2000, and the emissions from China exploded, grew very rapidly, crossing the EU in around about 2000. There were many reports around this time saying, well, we think maybe China will cross the US in 2030. And then the next year, well, we think maybe China will cross the US in 2020. And then suddenly the reports were saying, well, we think China may have crossed the US already. So the growth in Chinese emissions was somewhat unexpected and very rapid, related to China joining the World Trade Organization and strong export-driven growth in that period. After going into the 2010s, Chinese emissions sort of leveled out and may have even declined. There's some interesting factors which are going on there. But in the last 5 years or so, Chinese emissions have grown at a fairly steady rate. The US and the EU I'll tackle together as they have some similar factors there. They were growing quite similarly up to around about 1980, 1990. There's a little bit of divergence there. That's because of the collapse of the former Soviets. And the effects in Eastern Europe. But since, let's say, the mid-2000s, both have declined related to shifting out the old coal-powered fleet with a shift to gas and or renewables, solar and wind. Slightly different decline rates and slightly different factors in terms of policy in both countries, but fairly similar declines in the last decade. India is still a developing country with a lot of need for growth to lift the population out of poverty and get higher levels of development. We expect a lot of growth in energy consumption in India. At the moment, there's a lot of solar and wind being deployed in India, but also to meet the growing energy demand, a lot of fossil fuels are being used. And so this is leading to strong growth in India as well. In this figure down the bottom here, we have bunker fuels. Bunker fuels are the fuels used in international aviation and shipping. We've split those out in this figure to help explain what happened during the COVID drop in emissions, where aviation was very heavily impacted. Bunker fuels are a few percent of global emissions. At the top here, we have the black line, which is the rest of the world. There's 150 or so countries mixed into that black line, a lot of them developing countries, and as those countries increasing their energy system, lifting themselves out of poverty, reaching higher levels of energy consumption, the emissions are growing relatively strongly in the rest of the world. So that's a big picture of the top emitters going through the fossil fuels and the top countries. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Ivar, who will dive into what's going on in China.
So thank you. So China, of course, like Glenn said, is the biggest emitter at 30% of global fossil CO2 emissions. That's, of course, partly because of its large population and large economy, but what makes it so much higher than everybody else is its very energy-intensive economy, which has long been focused on industry, and in the past decade, especially infrastructure construction and housing construction. It's also very reliant on coal. So those two factors together mean that what happens to emissions tend to mirror what happens to the economy. The emissions go very much up when the economy grows quickly. So what's been happening to the economy in China lately? China emerged quite quickly from the 2020 pandemic and grew strongly through the last part of 2020 and the first part of 2021. But since the latter half of 2021, things have been quite challenging. So we had first a real estate debt crisis that basically froze construction activity more or less in late 2021 through much of 2022. We had repeated COVID lockdowns and, of course, high oil and gas prices. So combined, we've therefore projected based on monthly data that, first of all, oil and gas consumption actually fell in 2022, which is highly unusual for China. They almost always grow regardless. Coal consumption grew by a fraction of a percentage point, but I'll come back to that. But would actually have fallen probably if it weren't for a heat wave and drought that curbed hydropower production. And that overall emissions may have fallen by close to 1%. Electricity is being produced by each source. That's about 2/3 coal currently. It shows how much of the growth from year to year comes from what source. The brown thing here that says thermal is basically any power plant that burns stuff, but that's almost entirely coal. So what you can see is that electricity demand is growing very fast, and it's growing so fast that so far renewables haven't been able to keep up. So coal power is going up because electricity demand growth is so strong, but renewables are catching up quickly, and especially wind and solar, which grew so much that they displace as much CO2 emissions as is emitted by many large European countries now, for example. But what's going to be really challenging for China going forward, I think, is to curb overall energy demand growth so that renewables actually are able to not just catch up, but start displacing coal. And that's when you'll see emissions starting to fall. So with that, I hand over to my colleague, Robbie Andrew, who will take us through the rest of the world.